Okay. I was like, I'm like, yes, no, okay, now that makes it all make, I was like, oh, like, I met this person, I know this name, I'm like, oh, okay, yes. And I just realized that Rachel was so good. Yeah.
Yeah, she did summer school between 8th and 9th grade.
Yeah, yep, 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 yep.
Yeah.
And we're in, I'm at Golden Head.
You want me to say that?
Pretty good there? You're the one that got it.
Okay, perfect. Cool. Cool. Yep. I will do that.
I'll take notes.
You're next to me, Brandon.
As chair of the School Board Legislative Committee, I'm calling this meeting to order. The time is 7:03 p.m. As a committee of the school board, we would like to take this moment to respectfully acknowledge that we are residing on the traditional land of the Dene people. Our mission is to provide an excellent, equitable education in a safe, supportive environment so all students will succeed and contribute to a diverse and changing society. Ms. Richardson, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Burgess,
Here.
Mrs. Burnett,
Here.
Miss Maple,
Here.
Mr. Doran,
Here.
Miss Loa Carroll Hubbard,
Here.
Miss Julian,
Here.
Mrs. Hardy,
Here.
Mr. Shannon,
Here.
Superintendent Dr. Meinert,
Here.
Mr. Winford,
Here.
Miss Pepper McFarland,
Here.
Miss Johnson is excused, Mrs. Yarrow,
Here.
Mrs. Livadeus,
Here.
did I say that right?
Live a day.
Livaday, okay, thank you. Mr. Peter,
Here.
Mr. DeGraw,
Here.
Mr. Anderson,
Here.
Miss Herbie, and the board has a quorum.
Thank you. That brings us to adoption of the agenda to include minutes from December 11th, 2023. Can I have a motion?
Move to adopt the agenda to include minutes from December 11th, 2023.
Second.
Uh,
Without objection.
Without objection, we have adopted the agenda, including the minutes from last meeting. All right, and that brings us to item 5 on our agenda, the legislative priorities work, and at this time, I will turn it over to Dr. Meinert.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Burgess. Thanks, everybody, for coming tonight to work on our legislative priorities. Everybody should have a copy in front of them of some draft legislative priorities, as well as I shared a Google Doc with everybody today. If you don't have that, we can get that out to you. The current draft of the legislative priorities were based on our most of our legislative priorities last year. And you'll see there's an ask for an increase to the base student allocation, which is the primary mechanism for funding for the school district. The district has not received a large BSA increase for quite some time. As noted in that first bullet there, it's if you were to take inflation from 2011 to today, the BSA would actually be at 1808, and currently Increased by 1808. Yes, thank you for the clarification. Increased by 1808, and the past last year the conversation was around $680 increase. The year before was $340 increase. That's not keeping up with what inflation has been and what the needs are for school districts. If you've been around for a while, you've seen the drastic cuts that have happened due to the inadequate funding that's coming from the state through school districts. So I would recommend that the committee discusses that bullet and has some language about an increase to the base student allocation. One of the other primary things that the district has been working on the last couple of years is the Alaska Reads Act. It was a primary piece of legislation to ensure that our primary students are proficient in reading and writing, their literacy skills. What's different about Alaska's Reads Act is that it did not come attached with any meaningful funding for school districts. They did model the legislation after states like Mississippi and Colorado that injected millions of dollars along with their Reads Act, and Alaska did not do that. And so while we're seeing some tremendous growth despite the lack of investment, we think if they invested the Alaska Reads Act properly, that we'd see that much more return on the investment that they put into it. So I would encourage the committee to potentially think about asking the legislature to have targeted funding for the Reads Act. There's some language around deferred maintenance. The school district has over $367 million in deferred maintenance, so most of our schools have pretty substantial needs, facility needs. There's increasing transportation needs, so the school district has to subsidize the transportation that we provide for students, and it's projected this year that we have a small fund balance that's specifically for transportation that we will have burned through because of the lack of investment at the state level specifically for transportation. And so we're asking them to make another permanent increase to that transportation fund to ensure that we have enough dollars to properly transport our students to school. We know a big driver of attendance is providing adequate transportation, and so I believe that would be an important consideration for the legislature. Two additional, the career and technical education and the positive behavior and intervention and supports are two things in the last year that people that I've talked to and department heads have thought about adding to our legislative priority list, one being career and technical education. And so as districts have seen cuts to the BSA or not adequate funding for the BSA, oftentimes our hardest hit classes are electives or CTE classes. CTE classes are oftentimes the most expensive classes, one, because of the equipment needed for the classes, and two, because you have to have a smaller teacher to student ratio for career and technical education classes because of safety components and other things that might just do with the equipment that we have. And so we know our community and the state has been asking for us to develop a skilled workforce. And in order to do so, we need an investment specifically in career and technical education to do that. The other one, this one comes from talking with students and teachers about student behaviors in classrooms. And we know that's a huge challenge, not only for our school district, but school districts around the state. Students coming into our schools with different behaviors that they are exhibiting than they have in the past. And so one of the things that our district has done in the past is had a positive behavior intervention support model, but we have not had targeted funding to help continue training and support teachers in the classroom with positive behavior supports. And so I think that would be a good way for the legislature to provide some targeted funding for school districts, is to help school districts with a behavior intervention plan. And then lastly, last year we did have a piece on staff recruitment and retention. We know part of the equation is having adequate funding through the BSA, but also part of it is returning to a defined benefits plan that can attract teachers to the state. Alaska is the only state that doesn't have some form of a defined benefits plan for a retirement system, and we're seeing a huge outmigration of teachers due to that. Teachers often come up for their 5 years and there's nothing keeping them in the state or encouraging them to stay. And so they take that money and they run and they go somewhere else. And so returning to a defined benefits plan, we feel like would help teachers stay in our community and our state and be more invested in the education here.
Thank you, Dr. Meinert. And couple, we'll open this up to discussion here in a moment, but just wanted to hit on a couple procedural reminders real quick. First, the mic discipline. You know, it works best if it's, you know, maybe 6 inches to a foot away from where you're speaking from. Try to turn it off when you're done speaking, especially if you're one of the folks who's sitting near to or under a speaker in the room, so that we don't get interference and it doesn't pick up any background noise. And then I will be calling on folks, so make sure I can see your hand if you want to speak, and I will do my best to keep track of the order that I see those hands raised. Anything I'm missing?
One other reminder. And last year, the legislative committee got a little bit distracted by how to communicate these out. And so tonight, if we can focus on specifically what our talking points are, and then we have an amazing communications team that'll take these specific priorities and work on communicating them out in a variety of ways. One will be a RAC card that we can hand to legislators. There'll be a lot of social media pushes on it, and they're creative in the different ways that they communicate it out. So if tonight's time can be mostly focused on the specific priorities, that'll be helpful in being efficient.
Thanks, that's the one I was forgetting. Yeah, appreciate it. Okay, discussion. Ms. Maple.
Two things that came up last year in conversations that I'm curious if there's ways to incorporate into what's already here. And maybe Ms. Yarrow can help me from the conversations we had last year, that one of the things that came up in a lot of offices was that the SPED multiplier is not applied to homeschool students. Is that correct? In the formula? And that seemed to be something that, I mean, that would seem to be a big conversation happening with some of our interior delegation. And I assume that was because it was homeschool focused. And I wonder if there's ways to incorporate supporting our homeschool students in these talking points, because it seemed to be a topic that everybody was really receptive to. And so I don't know if that belongs in the BSA conversation, or I don't know.
Dr. Meinert?
Yeah, and I might encourage the committee to widen the scope of additional special education funding in general, and then ensure that there's a homeschool component of it. There is that multiplier for all students, but our school district and many school districts across the state have seen an explosion in special education needs without adequate funding to support that. And so I would encourage, I think that would be a great legislative priority to have just in general, for more special education funding, and then having a specific component for homeschool.
Mrs. Hardy.
To build on what Dr. Meinert said, I would really encourage us to add that as a bullet point too. Right now, it's a 20% block grant. So you take, if we have 100 students, 20 of them would be created on top of that. So you have 120 to cover your SPED needs. But inside our district, I don't have the exact number, even though Ms. Hall gave it to us a few weeks ago, our number is far above 20% of our students receiving special education services, especially when you add in speech and language and the other bit. And that 20% block grant is supposed to cover gifted education. It's supposed to cover our ELL. It's supposed to cover far more than just strictly special education. We have been doing more with less in SPED for a decade. And it really is impacting all of our students, and it's definitely impacting our students with IEPs to not have enough. So if we went with, let's increase it to a number more commiserate with, if we're going to stick with a block grant, the actual population of special education, although that doesn't really cover all the other things it's supposed to cover, as well as equally applying it to our homeschooled students, since we do provide homeschool special education resources. And actually, get a little bit into the minutia, We are even required by a federal law to provide special education services for students attending private schools if there is money within this little section. And we do for some at Monroe and other places. So the federal government expects us as the LEA to provide SPED to lots of people, but they barely fund it at 14%, and the state doesn't adequately fund it since we changed our foundation formula. Off my soapbox.
Mr. DeGraw.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. And just to answer Ms. Maple's question directly, you're correct. The 20% multiplier does not apply to homeschool students currently in the model.
Ms. Yarrow.
So I'm sorry, I did not have the takeaway with the SPED multiplier, but my biggest takeaway from Juneau last year was a lot of the legislature wanted more specific funding. So many were not a huge fan of the increase to the BSA if it wasn't measurable. And then quite often then we would go, you know what's measurable? The Alaska Reads Act. And if you kept funding that. So I think if we can get more specific and be a little bit more targeted with the ask, it'll be more receptive. Because they want numbers, and us just saying, fill the gap was not enough. But finding that compromise of what our educators think is measurable, what we can report on, what we can say, look how we've improved with what you gave us, the more we can do that and the more we can point money in that direction, I think the further we'll get faster.
I have Mr. DeGraw and then Ms. Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. And then just to provide a little bit of context, I'm not sure folks are aware, there have been at least a couple of pushes to get that multiplier attached to homeschool students. I think there's been a couple of bills introduced in the past 3 or 4 years. So it wouldn't be a new topic to legislators. And I'm not sure how much traction it got, but I think the second time around was either last year or the year prior. And it felt like there was a little bit of momentum there. And of course it died out, but it wouldn't be a new topic to legislators.
Mrs. Hardy.
Just kind of building off Ms. Yarrow's point and not to tell the communication teams what to do. But I agree with all of these bullets and the ones that we said so far, but we could change each one of them to be student outcome written. Like, this is what a BSA increase would mean to student outcomes. We could lower we could raise our FTEs, lower our PTR, and this is the direct outcome of that increase. And for each one, if we gave them those reasons, then it answers those legislators' things. And when we send people to advocate, they can look at that cheat sheet. Even the recruitment and retention, that has a direct impact on student outcomes. If we can't keep a teacher more than 3 years, they've never had the opportunity to get really good at their craft. It affects our students. The more emergency certs we have who aren't really prepared yet to be in the classroom, even though they're doing their best in an amazing job, it affects our students.
Ms. Doolian.
Thank you. I think that what is missing from here is the why, and that's what we kept hearing, just at the Alaska Association of School Board conference, and then, anytime that you're trying to, get somebody to do something, it's really that why. Right now we're talking about what we need. We're not talking about why we need it or what we've done. And there was such good feedback on your growth. And now we have that. We have, from our district data dashboard, the growth measurement of our students year over year. And that is a really good story. And we can talk about how, and I also think that there's another story that we need to tell, I'm looking at the umbrella. So I agree with what Mrs. Hardy discussed about adding those specific metrics as to, if we get this amount of a BSA, this is what we want to do with this, and this is our priority, and the community has spoken, and we have prioritization that we've gone through the budget committee that we can point to that public feedback. But the other thing that we should also, I'd like to weave in, is what we've been doing to also potentially right size based on enrollment. And I think that that's a message that is really important, that we tell people that we're also doing this hard, unpopular work.
Ms. Livaday.
Let me see if I can get this in here. Do I just push it and hold it down? Oh, there we go.
Yep, green means
I was like,
you're
wow,
on.
that's
Yep.
gonna really hurt my finger. I do like that, just because our family personally was affected by the closures of Ben Eielson and also, um, uh, Ben Eielson and also the elementary school that was on the base too, as well, Anderson. So I think having data is really important for anybody, and I was curious, when did we change, just so I have some information, when did the benefits change for the teachers here in Alaska? Was there a year?
Yeah,
2006?
2006.
Okay. I was just curious because if we're going to look at data, I'm like, hey, this is the data of what we are seeing, an increase in this. This is what we have. This is how many schools we've closed, what we're working with. These are the positive things that if we have this money, these are the things that we could do with it. But these are the things that we've had to do with less. We've had to close schools. We've had to have higher classroom. I know that my kid over at North Pole Middle also is in that situation as well. So I think having both of those points, because at that point, they're making a decision at the legislative level to go with, an A or a B decision on that and being able to see the A and B decision, I just think is important when they're having to look at everything. So I was just going to say that, just having some data in here. My other question is the transportation portion, just being on base and having the transportation. I've got Ryan on speed dial over at Durham all the time. And he's wonderful and great and answers all my questions. But I'm curious if we're going to have transportation questions. Like I talked to him for an hour about what are things. Okay, so I'm like, hey, I hear what you're saying, but what can I do? Like, I know that this is happening. What can I do for you? Who do I need to call on the legislator? Like, how do I make this work? And he talked about some of the things. And I don't know if I am jumbling two conversations, but I do remember him possibly saying Anchorage had a fleet that they had purchased to where they're not continually purchasing a new fleet, which, like I said, having somebody who's professional in this transportation part, I would love to have him have that conversation when we're making that bullet point, because he's going to be the expert on what's happening for transportation. But anyways, that was just my thought on that. I'm like, you
Okay,
can
thanks. I do want to just remind members that we are, the main goal of tonight is to determine what our priorities are, and discussing how we present those is something that we can do at a later time. But Mr. Dorn.
In terms of general areas, I think it's funding, my view, and is the number one thing. If we don't have the money, we can't do the job. I think I'm hesitant to say let's piecemeal it, because we've reached a point where we don't have the money to do bare operations, let alone the other things. And we've got to get that conversation beyond the idea of 680. That only leaves us years behind rather than decades behind. We need to bring it up at least to par, and knowing that that was only if we got the full 1,800 plus a little bit more, because next year it adds another 2% inflation to that. That only gets us to $2,011. And it begins a process of rebuilding. We've been cutting back since. So I think that we need to really make that strong case why we need that money based in there. The Alaska Reads Act should be certainly in there, is because it's otherwise effectively an unfunded mandate. And as long as it's considered that the money only can be used in a very restrictive way with that. If we're talking broadly, that says, oh, if we have lower PTR, which really is a BCA, an operational thing, then we can do more in terms of the Reads Act. We can get smaller groups. Not negating those types of pieces. Transportation needs to be a sub-piece with that funding, because, and my question here is, even if we got 1172, does that bring us to current cost? Or is that just,
1172.
right? So, so would, in the draft,
Yeah.
what do we need for transportation?
Mr. DeGraw.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. So to directly answer that question, the 270 increase would bring us up to par for 95 contracted routes, which is under the official contracted routes, but that is the range of the number of routes that we've been meeting for the last 12 to 18 months.
So then around that, what is it, making sure that we know what that number is? Because that is totally out of the BSA formula and stuff. But and I would say that we want to not say 45 days, we'd want to say early action, because that 45 days, what if it goes beyond and we still want as early as we can? The other thing, and several people have mentioned in this, which I think is important, is when we present, what has the underfunding impact been? We've closed schools, we've consolidated schools, not solely for financial reasons, but we have fewer students. But it's contributed to that. Increase in PTR, in the, what approximately 80% of VLP has gone, band orchestra at elementary. There are contributing factors to those things, but I think we really need to look at some of that. And then the last thing I was going to say is, if we want to talk about behavior interventions, et cetera, the school climate types of things, I would steer clear of PBIS in terms of a specific program, rather than, because again, we want something broader than we're advocating with other districts. PBIS may not be for other districts, we don't want them to tell us how to do it. We can decide our best thing, and PBIS may be our district approach, but there are lots of those. But I think the concept is still good.
I have Ms. Julian and then Ms. Yarrow.
Thank you. What I'd like to see pieced out from the base student allocation is we're asking for two things right there. We're asking for them to make a determination early, and we're also asking for an increase. And I think that we need to be clear that those are two different things. We want them to prioritize education funding in their agenda, in their calendar, so that they make those decisions earlier. And we also want an increase to the BSA. And I agree with Mr. Dorn that the more that we ask for restricted funds, that's more attractive, because you can track it. But we need to tie the BSA, I would say more generally to what we're trying to achieve, and the trust that they place in the school districts to make decisions about funding for the schools, to make those best decisions. Thank you.
Ms. Yarrow.
Sorry, I want to circle back to, forgive my ignorance, but PBIS, is that like a specific way or a method? Or if Mr. Duran is saying let's make that more vague, what would the other options be? Just as a parent, this is the first year that I've heard about some pretty extreme things happening in the classroom. So I'm particularly curious about that. Although I would also argue that those issues are probably a symptom of a lot of these other things that we're advocating for.
Yeah.
Sorry if that's a lot.
Go ahead, Dr. Mann.
Okay, thank you. So PBIS in general is generic. So there's a variety of specific programs that fall within PBIS. And the reason why we selected PBIS is the state does have a history of funding or providing targeted funding for PBIS, and it was successful in many districts in the past. And so we know coming out of COVID that there's been an uptick in student behaviors. And so keeping in line with what the state had done in the past, they're familiar with PBIS models, and that provides school districts with a lot of flexibility in determining what kind of specific programs they might use under PBIS.
Mrs. Hardy.
To piggyback off that, PBIS is explicitly mentioned in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It's one of the only things explicitly mentioned to address student behavior for students on IEPs. It's not mandated, but it's strongly encouraged by name. It is generic. You can implement PBIS. In my master's degree program, I took an entire class on positive behavioral sports interventions and different ways in which you do this. It can exist on a whole school level, like any educator in here can talk about. It can exist very down to doing behavior intervention plans and things with students. When I saw it, I wasn't shocked. I was kind of happy to see that that was in there. And it's been around since the early 2000s. So it's things people already know and can talk about and feel good.
Ms. McFarland.
I'm a little bit curious that maybe this is too much. Because most of these are funding. It just feels to me like we could cover a whole lot of it within just the BSA. And some of this is probably presentation. Because if we ask me to go to the legislature and talk about all these at once, I would get totally lost. But if you ask me to go and talk about the BSA and all of the things that that type of funding will help in my classroom, I could do that. I almost feel like they could be condensed because transportation's funded separately, right? Okay. That one would be separate. I think the Alaska Reads Act might be separate just because it was specific legislation. But several of these other ones could easily just be, I'm here to talk about the BSA. Here are the things that it would affect.
Mrs. Hardy.
Well, I would totally agree with you that it would be great if we could just say, let's do your job and do the BSA. I think the list has come out of kind of to Ms. Maple and Ms. Yarrow's point. The legislators are done hearing about the BSA. It almost just washes right over them. They don't want to hear it. They think it's just numbers that we come out. That's why we're using legislative finance's own numbers. But what they want is targeted funding. So then they can be like, oh, well, we'll give you this for Alaska. They want to piecemeal it, and they want to feel in control and in charge of every little bit they're giving us.
Dr. Miner.
Yeah, I think Ms. Hardy covered it well. It is an intentional approach. Legislators have come to us and asked for, tell us more than just a BSA. What other types of things can we specifically fund that would help your district improve student outcomes? And so this list was an attempt at that conversation and knowing who's in the governor's seat and who's in the legislature right now. I think this approach might be appropriate at this time.
Mr. Dorn.
Okay, some of the conversation that took place during the Alaska School Board's state conference around this year's bipartisan majorities is that a focus on the BSA is not remiss. And that came from a lot of different quarters. Yes, it's nice, and we need to have ready those targeted things and how the BSA would actually support some of these things. I mean, obviously, deferred maintenance is outside the BSA and has to be dealt with. That's the capital budget, and that's a separate piece. But even in terms of CTE, if they would fund the BSA, we would get more CTE funding. If they just target it, the only thing here is the BSA stays. Everything else is one time. And so that's the problem. We could get, we might have gotten another $5 million for the Alaska Reads Act this year until it was vetoed, but it was only one time. And that's the problem with the targeted, and as the legislature has done that over the years, they've had different one-time fundings, targeting certain things. They called it different things at different times. And sometimes they even did it for 2 or 3 years in a row. But unless we get permanent funding, we are in jeopardy. And that's where I think our focus and taking advantage of both chambers under bipartisan coalition who have said, both of them, education is the top of their thing. So, we have to it behooves us to really make a strong case for why the BSA rather than targeted. But how will it help these other things? Absolutely, we need to be ready to address.
Dr. Minnick?
I think there's a couple things to that. Any of the targeted funding pieces could be in more permanent funding increases, so there's nothing that limits the legislature in making those pieces more robust. I would also caution us in narrowing it down to just the BSA, because if we send people down to Juneau and they don't have specifics on what you would do with a BSA increase above and beyond just asking for the money, at least if we have some targeted items there, it helps kind of guide those conversations. It's a jumping off point to say, even if we don't attach like specific dollar amounts to it, like, hey, this is what we're doing along the Alaska READS Act, and this is why we need career and technical education funding. And I do think the CTE funding connects with the legislature. We know we've got a big labor need in the state, and just having a BSA increase doesn't always directly impact CTE classes. We hope it does, but if they do make it targeted, we know specifically that it's carved out and schools have to use that funding for career and technical education. And so I would just advocate for a broader approach. If it were me in the room, I think I could go down the list pretty easily, but I won't be always the one that's going to be advocating. And so giving our stakeholders a little bit more to start those conversations and talk about would be a good approach.
Ms. Maple?
I won't belabor it, but just quickly, I think that being able to have more nuanced conversations, which is of course not why we're here tonight, about the BSA and how it is tied into all of these things, and how, of course, we need flexible funding. And the idea is that we want permanent increases, not all of these one time. The experience that I know that specifically that Ms. Yarrow and I had last year, and almost every legislator we met with will be back in Juneau in the spring, was genuine like laughter at folks walking in talking about the BSA. There were like red pins that had the goal number, and it was like in the Capitol, it was a joke that all of these, and we went down with a bunch of other school boards. We're all down there together. The AASB is helping with our messaging, and the messaging that we are walking into the rooms with was truly laughed at. And we pivoted, and I think pivoted quite well, and talked about other stuff, and didn't wear the pins. Sorry, AASB. But I think that being intentional in having the priorities that we're focused on tonight be more than just the BSA, and then also having the knowledge that, that Dr. Meyer's talking about and that you're talking about, Mr. Dorn, to be able to walk in and make that argument, but in a nuanced way, I think is important.
Ms. Yarrow?
Thank you. So yeah, I'm gonna reinforce that. I really like this plan for multiple reasons. It gives you the talking points. As Ms. Maple said, when we went in, we were told kind of to go in guns blazing, like this or nothing, and our group kind of looked at each other and we're like, yeah, we're gonna go a little rogue. And you have to open up with the conversation. You have to see where their priorities are as it relates to education. And if you can open with that and then have these marching orders, you can pull from this, okay, you're going to align with this. We can focus on this. We can talk about this. And with any compromise, which the legislature is always going to be a compromise, it's always going to be a tug of war. The more items you have, like this is a one pager, this is not paralysis by analysis, and we could beef it up a little bit longer any legislator will read this page. It won't be their staffer. They will read it because it's only one page. And they'll be able to pick and choose. We will get some of these things. We won't get all of them. Absolutely not. We won't. But if you can have them broken out like this, you will get some of them and we will make progress and we will get closer. So I applaud this. I think there's very few changes that need to be made. And I think we have a really great starting off point, especially from where we were last year when I was on the committee. I feel like we have a much clearer vision going in much earlier. So this is wonderful. But I would improve this. I would not take away from it.
Mr. DeGraw, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. And to that point, to piggyback on that, I think we really need to focus on who in the legislature do we need to advocate directly to and to change their perspective and to change and know their priorities, right? So what are the priorities of the specific legislators that we need to try to influence to change their votes? It's easy to go in, and we've all done it, and it's appropriate that we go into certain offices and we're preaching to the choir. But specifically knowing this has been a no vote in the past, this person, and so what do our talking points need to be to specifically influence this person right here to try to change their vote? I think we would do ourselves a lot of benefit to tailor the talking points specifically to those folks that we know they've been no votes in the past, and we're trying to change them to yes votes.
Ms. Julian.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Mr. DeGraw. That's exactly the concern that I have. So it's not adding to this, but really leading with the growth. The growth metrics to me are the thing that changed the talking points for a few legislators that have not traditionally supported education funding. I think that that's one of the reasons why I want to break out early funding and the BSA is because those two things are two different conversations that are happening. But I'm looking at the October 2nd, 2024 letter from Commissioner Bishop, and what concerns me is that there is still this false narrative that talks about 44.5% of correspondence students met state standards compared with the state average of 31.5%. It's still talking about the success of financial investments being coupled with accountability. So I think that everything that we do has to lead with our growth and that we're setting students in the right direction. And perhaps we're not asking for a BSA increase. Perhaps we're saying, help us lower PTR to the state average for charter schools. Help us lower, and that's what I want to ask for. And by doing that, we need an increase to the BSA.
Can I respond to that? So,
Go ahead,
yeah,
Dr.
I think
Meyer.
we're on the same lines entirely. You know how I feel about accountability and leading with that conversation. I think we've made a lot of good progress in the last year of talking to our lawmakers and saying, we're not afraid of accountability. Let's be sure when we say accountability, let's define what accountability is. Because school districts, I think, are some of the most transparent organizations in the world. And so we already are accountable for financial audits, for a variety of very robust reports that both the state and the federal governments require from us. Many of our students take standardized testing by the state, and one of those accountability pieces might be talking about homeschool or correspondence students and requiring them to have or asking them to test on a greater basis than what our brick and mortar students do. And so having those accountability pieces, I think, is part of what will build into kind of the overall talking points that go along with these legislative priorities. So just wanted to say that I support kind of your vision of ensuring that we're tying these to student outcomes and how that's going to look when they're talking about accountability, because there will be a lot of conversation around that this legislative session, and I don't think we should shy away from that.
Mr. Dorn.
Couple of things picking up. I like the idea of targeted advocacy versus targeted funding. But I think in terms of knowing who wants what among our legislators and giving them that information, making sure we educate them. I think when we talk about educating, when with the BSA, the commissioner in that same letter indicated that they had given money equivalent of $680 in the BSA. It was not. And so if she's giving that message and legislators are thinking that, we need to make sure we give the correct information. That was one-time money, not in the BSA. It was distributed following the formula, but not in the BSA. So giving, so I think, you know, one of the pieces is they don't want to talk about the BSA and they want to laugh about it because they're ignorant. Now, that's not going to get me a hearing for me to say that with that person evident, possibly. But we need to, and I need to figure out how do we say it in a way that they understand what impact this is having and has had. And so we can say, if we have this money and we can count on it, we can help teachers stay, because not only do we have a retention problem because we don't have any incentive for them to stay for a pension, but we can't say, oh, we'll be able to pay it next year. And it's not just for teachers, it's all our educators. And I think that's, it has to be a talking point, teachers and our other educators, our support staff, because we are short across the board with it. And people are looking for jobs that they can count on. You know, so how do we turn this? So I think the targeted advocacy, I think, is really significant and is important as we go, as well as our general base where we head. So,
Mr. Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. This is my first meeting with this committee here, and I thought it was going to be a sponge tonight, but as I'm listening to everybody talk, I'm thinking, okay, how can I contribute however I can? So kind of piggybacking off what Mr. Doran said, I'm thinking about, you know, when in my profession, when I'm going to my boss, you know, I'm going there with a specific ask. I go into his office, say, hey, look, here's a problem. Here's why it's an issue. This is how it's going to affect us. This is how it affects our staff. This is how it affects our organization, blah, 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 blah. All right, so here's the solution. This is how it fix everything, blah, blah, blah. Go through all of that stuff. This is how much it's going to cost. And in my organization, I got a reputation for saying, you're asking me for money. So, you know, that's one part of it right there. But also, I'm thinking also strategically, you know, we talk about strategic planning out 3 years, 5 years, how are you going to plan things out for your organization? And just thinking about, well, what are those goals you want to achieve down the road? And just make them very specific goals, and how are you going to achieve them? And again, just tying into how much it costs. And so, I mean, I have much more to offer you folks tonight, but I'm really glad to be here and listen in. So this is really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just gonna put myself in for a second. I wanted to just revisit something that Ms. Julian had brought up and ask a clarifying question if I can. Because I think what you were suggesting was on our first, under the BSA, the first bullet there, you were suggesting splitting out the timing into a separate, into its own bullet, is that?
Yeah, that's my recommendation, because especially looking at Representative Prax and the work that he was doing to talk about education funding earlier. I think that there's two things that we could, you know, kind of tackle there, which is prioritize this on your agenda earlier, prioritize this in the session earlier, get this done earlier, please, and increase the BSA. But the BSA is a separate talking point. So we're asking for them to prioritize this on the agenda first and make this a priority. Show us that this is a priority to you.
I want to open that up to discussion as we're crafting these. So get a sense of the of what the committee feels on that point. Mr. DeGraw.
Yeah, I 100% agree with Ms. Julian's comments. This might be a technicality, but I think it needs to be said. There's a term, forward funding, that has been used in the past, and we want to avoid that now because forward funding, inadequate funding does us no good. So, but that's a term that a lot of people are familiar with. So we don't want to confuse this with forward funding. It's just as Ms. Julian said, it's dealing up education funding on a year-by-year basis much earlier in the legislative session to where we're not scrambling in the middle of June. So just forward funding is a 4-letter word at this point because funding's not adequate. If they forward funded it adequate funding, that'd be very different if we were in that arena, but we're not. We're in extremely deficit funding situation, and so we don't want to forward fund that at all. So just a technicality to make people aware of.
Mrs. Hardy.
I'll say breaking it out also gives them the ability to advocate as its own point in that if we pass it earlier, then the governor would have to veto it in session. And that would have to happen. So the earlier they can pass something, the earlier it lands on the governor's desk and we start the clock. So it's almost its own advocacy point. Let's have the fight now, not wait until the last minute we're talking about special sessions and other things.
Mr. Doran.
I keep looking at the very first words there, ensure predictable and sustainable funding, which is really the BSA. That is the mechanism, and that's not going to be thrown out. You know, so that is the mechanism that gives us predictable and sustainable, and should be our first focus. Early should be the second point of that. For a whole variety of reasons. There's the political of whether there be vetoes and overrides or those types of things, but also because of contracts, contractual obligations, et cetera, for districts with employees and employees making a decision. Am I going to wait around and see whether there's money there or not? You know, so they may make those decisions beyond the contracts. So right now we're faced with with the one-time funding, do we count on some of it, all of it next year? So if what we need for schools is predictable and sustainable, and that's the BSA. So I'm real hesitant about watering that down. And to a certain extent, I'd say, if you really work on increasing the BSA to give predictable, sustainable, and operationally sound money for it, then if you take longer, but let's get there, nice to get it in those early days. And the legislatures have done that in the past. But I'm concerned about are missing how do we really do that advocacy for something that we depend on. And it's the only thing we can depend on. We cannot depend on the borough amount other than what the state says you will minimally give us, which is still based on the BSA. Because it comes right off the BSA. It's nothing additional to us. So.
Ms. LaPlante.
In my experience talking with politicians, legislatures, there's a sense of like, we don't want to fund public education because we keep throwing money at it and basically there's no evidence that that money is making things happen. And I think we do have an opportunity with the Alaska Reads Act to show that without very much money at all, we absolutely made things happen. And so if we could make this much progress with just a little bit of money, think what we could do with more. I don't know quite how to use that, but I feel like if their constant criticism is we don't see results, we put money and nothing comes from it, which is sort of a business, view of the world, then here's an opportunity to say, you gave us a little bit of seed money and look what we grew with that. And if you gave us even more, we promise we will have these results and better. So I think our growth is a helpful tool if we figure out how to use that.
Ms. Livaday.
There we go. Okay. I did have a couple questions. When you guys are saying, just because I am not versed in this, when you're saying the 45 days, you're asking for that in advance, because what Brandy was saying was that there were special sessions that were held, so I'm guessing also finances are also happening because of that. I'm just wanting to have clarification and understanding the 45 days of legislation. What is that timeline that we're asking for? What date, for me personally?
They're just saying the first 45 days of the legislative session. So when the legislature comes back in session, and once the new people are sworn in and all of that, within those first 45 days, we would like you to pass education funding. So that, and a lot of them want to do that because they want to tackle energy, and education sucked the entire session. That was the only thing they could really accomplish. And then they tried in the last few days to do everything else. So it behooves us and them to get it done early. And then the governor, when you're in session, has a certain timeline of when he has to either veto or sign something. He has a tendency to leave things on his desk until the very last day.
Okay.
So he runs out a clock. The sooner we can start that clock, the sooner we know what battle we're fighting.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that clarification. I also was going to say, I agree with Ms. LaPlante, right? The verbiage is crucial. I know that when I was calling the governor's office, and I have an old teacher that works for the governors, I called him directly and asked him about the school closures and the funding when this was all happening last year and what we could do. The same answers were being given to me, which are, you guys all know the answers that are being given. So I think verbiage is crucial for that, and the money that it's going to also benefit, how this is going to benefit them. I feel like if somebody was coming to me and want something from me, how is this going to benefit me? Although they are public servants, unfortunately, there is a certain agenda that maybe some people have, or what they think is the best way to do things. So I think that is crucial, is being able to let them know how this benefits their state. Speaking from a military standpoint, a military family, when I was talking to the governor's office, that was crucial, and the reason why Colonel Townsend got really involved in that as well. I mean, that affected his family, but how it affects the bottom dollar for these individuals here. The military is huge and brings in a lot of income to this area and into Anchorage as well. So I feel like being able to source that as well and saying, hey, we've got these military families coming in. I know that everybody benefits from that. I'm an Alaskan, by the way. I grew up in Anchorage. So I graduated from high school down there. So this is why I'm very big into this. But I think that's crucial to let them know, hey, bottom dollar here for you. This is how it benefits you. If they don't want to hear about the BSA, I feel like, okay, well, let me tell you how this affects your money, how this affects you, how this affects the area that you're in. That is how I feel like politicians seem to have that conversation. I would like to assume that they do care, but I feel like being able to have that proper verbiage is really, really crucial about how to present this in the proper way that it makes sense for a politician's mind. And to be able to, there's a really polite way to go about this and the way that it would make sense to them. But I do think that that's important to see where this affects, their bottom line. So, yeah.
Mrs. Hardy.
It was to Ms. LaPlante's point, and maybe just in how we might structure it, instead of saying, look what we did with this little, look what we can do with more, because they may be like, well, you're doing great with little, you don't need more. Yeah, but something that Becky Zybral has said multiple times is, if we could only fund, because at her school, they have more resources. It's a Title I school, and they used their aides and staffed things with that money. So if we say, look at what a school with appropriate resources or close to appropriate resources is able to do and the growth they make, what if every school could have that, but that's going to take this investment to staff that, to get these numbers down to here for our grouping size. It might be a less risky way to thread that needle.
Mr. Dorn.
Building on the last three comments, what struck me as Ms. Blunt was talking, we've got some current data on the Alaska Reads Our literacy effort in our district. And I think including that, since we're doing K-12, and I think especially what we're doing at middle school and high school, is we need to highlight those. But with the other piece of information we have, I think relatively reachable, is one of our underfunding impacts was the RTI, the Response to Instruction program, went away. All our tutors went away. And we have data as to what impact that had. So we lost that. And it's a great example to show if we had funding, this is what we could do. We have experience with it, and we've proven it. We won't go back to Erie, which I know you remember the beginning days of that. That's too far back. But the RTI was something we cut, reading tutors, because of lack of funds. So that can be part of our talking point. I think the other thing that's really important has come up a lot. I mean, yes, legislators say, well, we want accountability. Okay, what is accountability? It's very hard to get an answer from them. What is accountability? What do they want to see? And where bits and pieces are used, I think we need to make sure we're really clear and correct misinformation or misleading information, just like the commissioner said that 44% of homeschool students were proficient versus 34% of neighborhood schools. Okay. What she left out was only less than 15%, is 14.7 something percent of homeschool students took the test. 90+% of students in neighborhood schools took the test. So it's a misnomer, and those are as we talk about talking points, which I think is as part of this conversation as important as what we say. I'd love to have one of our priorities is a good accountability system, which we do not have, and which the state refuses to look at. But we need to make sure that what is there, we have the information, we have maps, we have other information, and I think the talking points that'll come in this district with the administration working, other indicators of student success. What are our graduates doing, and et cetera, and things like that. So, but I think we need to make sure we have the right information and make sure we keep bringing that to them, because they're getting erroneous information. And so.
Ms. Julian.
I have a question about the career and technical education piece. When we're asking legislators for targeted funding for career and technical education programs, could that also, could we also use those types of funds in building out the facilities that are needed if we were going to expand career and technical education programs, expanding our facilities as well, or would that need to be a separate ask since it's a capital request as well?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. If it were a large capital improvement, then that would be something a little bit different than building out programs within existing facilities. It would be more along capital improvement funds, which we do have some CIP projects currently submitted to provide additional spaces for CTE. One that comes to my mind is for Lathrop High School to rebuild their building trades classroom, because currently it's in basically like a regular classroom that's been retrofitted to do building trades and not in the big shop space.
So then I guess my follow-up question is, do we want to in expanding our programs, will we also want to prioritize capital investments in career and technical education? Or is that not good, or should we just leave that with the CIP?
I would leave it with the CIP right now. I think our focus first would be program development, and then as we see the needs on the capital side go in that direction. I do think we have pretty good facilities overall for our CTE programs. So good question, though.
Ms. Yarrow.
Since it feels like we're wrapping this portion up, I'll just put it out there. Talking points are important. Pronunciation is also important. So if you're calling or speaking with your legislators, it's prox like ox and Dunleavy like gravy. Those are the two most commonly mispronounced. So just a little way to remember.
Mr. Dorn.
Just a thought as we're going, and it might be interesting for us to have some reference points, what some of the other organizations are setting up as their priorities for education. I'm thinking of NEA, I'm thinking of the Principals Associations, the superintendents, the School Boards Association, so we don't have to have the same ones, but it's complementarity, and it's helpful to know what different groups are advocating for, so we're not going against, but can be complementary to them, as well as they for us. I know when I used to go down for the Principals Association, always checking with the district to make sure I knew exactly what the district was doing, even though our Principals Associations may be a little bit different, so we have different interests, but we didn't want to work against each other. And the advantage when we were down there in the hallways talking to other organizations that were there, it was nice to know what we had in commonality and to build on that. So,
Ms. McFarland.
NEAs are very, very similar. We want a permanent increase to the BSA. We want defined benefit retirement. We want easier licensure for our military teachers coming in. Obviously, money for READS Act and transportation. So very, very similar.
Mr. Anderson. I can't see your name tag.
I'd like to speak about the capital improvement projects and deferred maintenance and how that really fits into the targeted funding aspect that we talked about. Capital improvement fits the bill really well of targeted funding. And I think we're going to make it a lot easier for the legislature to target that funding if we're able to consolidate some buildings. Because until we do consolidate buildings adequately, they really are trying to hit a moving target. So I think that's important to think about. And we can really help them out by making the target not moving for them anymore. Thanks.
Mr. Dorn.
Thinking on that, in terms of the capital improvement, it might be worth focusing that, targeting it as to what it is that we want, what would be our top one or two things that we would, as our district, because the deferred maintenance and the dollar amount is so big that if we can say this really is, and we have a bullet point about that one or two, it doesn't, it may impact the capital budget as such. It may also bring about consideration for a specific allocation, and that has happened over the years outside the capital budget and outside, but a delegation has come together and has funded those types of things. But it makes it a more manageable deal, then, yeah, okay, we know you got a lot of work to do, but that might be something to do some focus on.
Dr. Minor?
Yeah, if we wanted to go in that direction, I might recommend that we include a piece about funding North Pole High School's mechanical maintenance upgrade, because I think that's number 7 on the state CIP list right now, and so that does give them something tangible to hold on to, and could very realistically fund down through number 7 or number 8 on that list. So that might be something, and then maybe a smaller project that's currently on a list, but that they could fund, outside of the capital project as well.
Ms. Yarrow?
So if you were going to highlight North Pole, you could also use the excellent work that they're doing in CTE, the fact that they have absorbed a lot of the closure from last year. So I think that 1 makes sense, 2 would be great, and 3, I was just going to say, like, from a borough level, if we're going to point something out and say, let's focus on this, let's be real careful that we don't get, even though I don't agree and I understand the policies, let's not get like a puppy palace situation going on where they're going to laugh at us. Like, let's be really, really logical and look over the whole thing. But I think North Pole is a great example and something to piece out.
Dr. Minor?
Yeah, and the only reason I picked North Pole is because North Pole is the highest ranked project on the state's list currently, and so not playing favorites with our other schools in the district, but by their standards, that would be the one to call out, and one that the borough has already started partially funding, which is great because they're working on the boiler upgrade for us, and that's a piece of that overall mechanical upgrade with North Pole High.
Mr. Dorn?
Brainstorming here, is it worth looking at, as we go down the line, what things are most in jeopardy if we do not get funding? I don't want to get too far ahead of our budget process, but we do have things that we know we're going to have to.
Yes, I mean, that's what our both our 6-year state and borough CIP lists are, those prioritized items that we think are the kind of most in jeopardy of potential failings that would impact schools in a large way. But are you thinking outside of
I was
that?
thinking beyond CIP, the capital improvements. I was thinking, if we don't get the money, we're going to have classes of 30. And I'm just
sure.
picking that number out of the air. So I don't want to be mismo. But in terms of what, if we don't get, what are we facing? Because I think they could say, what, you made it through last year. You're making it through this year. Well, what about, and I'm just thinking, I guess it's talking points, how we provide a context. Because I think the big bullet is going to be there. I mean, it's funding wherever it goes, but how do we talk to that, make our case for it?
Yeah, and I think that gets a bit to the how on how we communicate it. But tomorrow night, Mr. DeGraw will give a budget presentation to the school board and the community, and so it's important for this group and the community to understand that the $680 increase that we got last year, if we assume that in the budget along with the same revenue from the borough, that leaves us with a $16 million deficit. And so $16 million deficit is huge, given all of the cuts that we've recently made. And so, yeah, I think we can have a lot of talking points around what $16 million looks like, or even greater cuts if, we didn't even realize the 680 increase to our BSA. So we would be prepared with that.
Ms. Yarrow?
What was our deficit last year that we were facing?
Mr. DeGraw?
It was in the range we put out around the same time, was about an $18 to $22 million deficit. it settled right around 1920.
Yeah, without the assumption of any kind of BSA increase, it was around 28 to 30 million, which is similar to the deficit we would be facing here. I think there's a little bit more predictability this year that we would hopefully get at least the 680, which last year was a big gamble. We had kind of no idea where the legislature would land on a potential increase for funding for school districts.
All right, well, sounds like discussion is kind of winding down here, and being conscientious of time, I'm going to go ahead and ask administration if they need any clarification or. Okay. I'm not sure that I heard a clear consensus about splitting out the timing question. Are folks generally supportive of that? I'm just going to look around the room. Okay, all right, we've got that. Any other discussion? So we've talked a lot about the what's in front of us here in terms of what we're carrying forward from last year. There was a little bit of discussion about additional ideas for other focus areas. Do folks want to continue those ideas? I think the discussion, there was a little bit of discussion on being more general about SPED funding. I think it sounded like there was a lot of agreement there, though.
Maybe we could do like a thumbs up. I fully agree that we should add a special education funding like this. Maybe I could be persuaded, or a down, no way for that. And we could get an idea of where the committee lies on that topic.
Great idea. Mr.
I
Dohan?
asked for a clarification.
Sure.
How much the SPED funding actually is just passed through from the feds versus what the state is adding to it? And, because the reason I asked the question is we know the feds don't fund it all, the state doesn't fund it all. If we make it a bullet, where does it really go? Are we asking for a change in the formulation? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the detail of the bullet would be at this time. I think if the group feels like there's support to craft a bullet for support around special education, then we can get with Mr. DeGraw and our special education folks to put together a statement, and that could go in the legislative priorities, and then we could present that to the board of why we crafted the statement the way it's crafted on the priorities. But in terms of the minutia of, how it would come from the feds to the state to us, I'm not sure at this time, like, what that wording would be.
Mrs. Hardy?
Okay, you can do Ms. Lividat.
Okay, Ms. Lividay.
I guess I'm just curious because you'd probably be able to explain it, or I've heard you talk about it the most. If you could explain to me, I only heard the very first portion where you're saying, I'm guessing we're underfunded because everything's underfunded. So I'm not surprised, but can you give just a small clarification? That way I understand exactly what is being asked.
Sure. Special education comes from the federal law that is the Individuals Disabilities Act. It's supposed to be funded, but it's funded by the federal government around 14% of what they agreed they were going to fund. So they have underfunded it for decades. We're not really going to change that, and it's not looking good that that's going to change anytime soon. The state bears the brunt of the majority of the special education funding, and currently, when they changed the foundation formula to the current one we have now, we used to fund on a per student basis, and when they switched to this, they did it as a block grant, which means they just take your enrollment, put it through this multiplier, and that money, they say, you should be able to cover SPED with that. That looks good. It doesn't relate to how many students you have. It doesn't relate to their needs. The only exception is students with pervasive disabilities, and those are what we call intensively funded students, and that's when you hear people say, oh, we'll get 13 times the BSA. And that's true, but those students are individually qualified and they have to have extensive paperwork and they have to have it affecting multiple life areas, have medical support generally, like, and the state checks every single student that's intensively funded. And there's other things that you might have a student who has an out-of-district placement, and our district would be paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for this student to be receiving those needs in a different state, even though we're not funded at all for that student. You can appeal, you can do different things. SPED is a very complicated thing, and it is severely underfunded. Ms. Hall speaks brilliantly about it, and just when you look at how many students we had who qualified under IDEA for IEPs in 2011 versus now, it's huge, but the funding has not changed. It's the same, so we're just having to address these federally mandated needs with a lot less resources.
Mr. Dorn.
With this, with CTE, things that go through the funding formula, are we then advocating to review the whole funding formula, or are we just picking things out? Which is my concern. We get more and more scattered.
I would not advocate for the legislature to mess with the formula. Everything that I've heard is that's probably a 2 to 4 year process in terms of them cracking it open and re-examining it. But I do think that there's room for targeted funding, even though there's some of those multipliers within the formula. And the state's demonstrated that in the past, that even though that the formula exists, they've provided targeted funding or grants to school districts in other areas. So I think it's a good clarification, but I would recommend that we don't encourage the legislature to crack open the formula to try to do this year in this legislative session.
Okay, since discussion seems to be winding down and people are, the committee as a whole seems pretty comfortable with what's here and what we've discussed to modify it. The other item under number 5 is ranking of priorities. And so the question, I think, is, do we want to rank them at all? Or do we want to say, here are our priorities? And then if the committee decides that we do want to rank them, then we'll have that discussion. So let's start with first question. Open it up to discussion. Ms. Maple.
I would say that they don't need to be ranked. Funding is the primary and everything else exists within that. And we'll all have the flexibility within one-on-one conversations to make it clear that it's all about funding and it's all of these things.
You want to touch on that?
I would agree with Ms. Maple.
Any further discussion there? Is everybody generally in agreement? Okay, sounds good. Well, I'm going to pause for 1 minute to give folks a chance to throw in some last thoughts here. But if there are no more, if there's no more discussion, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Can I say one thing before we?
Go ahead, Dr. Miner.
Okay. So thank you for the conversation tonight. I think it was really rich and helps build even a more robust legislative priority list. Going out of this, I'll work with Rebecca and her team to recraft some of the priorities and add potentially a special education general priority within that. We'll send it out to this group for feedback. You're going to need to be real timely in your feedback because we are going to try to bring it to the board on the December 3rd. Is that the first, December 2nd or December 3rd? I don't know. December 3rd board meeting where the board will then have a conversation about the priorities as well. But there was a hope that the board would act on these early, so we can have conversations on our priorities before the legislators go down to Juneau. I think that's really important that we try to get with them prior to, because once the session hits, it's harder to have those robust conversations with them.
Ms. McFarland?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Without objection, we are adjourned.